Good evening and welcome to episode 8 of Bloodshed and Breadcrumbs. I hope y'all have had a wonderful week since the last time we hung out. We're winding down season 1, and I thought for these last few episodes we'd talk about some stories that are near and dear to my heart. Tonight I want to take you back to South Carolina, summer of 1985. The year 2 young girls were murdered not far from where I grew up. I was just 13 at the time, and the crime happened only about 45 miles from my hometown, and I remember it so clearly, like it just happened. The whole state was shaken. Parents were terrified, doing everything they could to keep us safe, and for us kids, it meant no bike rides, no sleepovers, no wandering off without an adult glued to our side. Total buzzkills for summer break. But back then, we didn't get it. We were just kids, carefree, clueless, thinking the world was still safe. Looking back, I think that was the summer those carefree days came to an end. There's a lot to unpack here, so stick with me. This story's got layers. So late spring of 85, Shari Faye Smith was 17. She was full of life and counting down the days to her high school graduation. She was even set to sing the national anthem at the graduation ceremony. On May 31st, after hitting up a graduation pool party, she pulled into her family's driveway just like any other day. Just a quick stop to grab the mail at the mailbox. But in that one ordinary moment, everything changed. She stepped out of her car and vanished. Broad daylight. And her dad was just yards away, and yet somehow his talented, blonde-haired daughter was gone. And all that remained was the mail she'd reached for and her car still running. Shari's dad, Bob, was working upstairs in his home office when she pulled into the driveway. He glanced out the window, saw her hop out to get the mail, and then went back to whatever he was working on. Just a few minutes later, he looked up again, and something felt off. Her car was still there, engine running, but no sign of Shari. That's when he dropped everything and ran outside to check. The car was exactly where she had left it. Keys still in the ignition. Her purse sitting inside. But Shari? Gone. Just gone. Bob raced back inside and called the Lexington County Sheriff's Office. The sheriff at the time was James Metz, and he was a family friend actually. As soon as he got the call, he headed straight to the Smith's house. When he arrived, Shari's blue Chevy Chevette, and if you don't know what that is, Google it. It's, at the time we didn't think they were the most stylish cars, but now looking back, my family had one, so now just they're weird little cars, but or in my opinion. But anyway, when Sheriff Metz arrived at the Smith's house, Shari's blue Chevy Chevette was still parked at the end of the driveway, and her parents were standing by the front door. They were clearly shaken and desperate for answers. Sheriff Metz had known Shari since she was little. He knew her heart, knew she was a good kid. So when he got that call, he didn't hesitate. Something was wrong, really wrong. There was just no way Shari could have taken off on her own, not like that. The sheriff's department kicked it into high gear immediately. They started scouring the area, driving up and down every winding country road near the Smith's home, hoping for anything, a clue, a sign, a breadcrumb. And then they spotted it, a red bandana lying out in the open. Bob recognized it instantly. It was the one Shari had been wearing when he saw her at the mailbox. That was the first real sign investigators had, and it pointed to one really terrifying possibility. Shari had been kidnapped. But beyond that, nothing. No trail, no witnesses, just silence. As the hours dragged on, the weight of it all settled in. No new clues, no leads, just a family stuck in the worst kind of limbo, wondering if their daughter was hurt, if she was scared, or if she was even still alive. The not knowing, that's what breaks you. The next morning, the community showed up in full force. 300 volunteers hit the ground, walking through fields and woods, while aircraft circled overhead, scanning the skies above Lexington. Everyone was hoping for something, anything. But after hours of searching, there was still nothing. And then, as night gave way to another day, the phone calls began. It was 3 a.m. when the house phone rang. Shari's mom, Hilda, picked up, probably thinking it was someone from the sheriff's office with an update, but it wasn't. It was the man who had taken her daughter. Imagine that moment, realizing you're speaking to your child's kidnapper. He told Hilda that Shari was still alive and demanded that the search be called off. Not asked, demanded. He described exactly what Shari had been wearing and said she'd be getting proof in the mail soon. He was also warned that he also gave the warning that he would be calling them again. And just like that, the line went dead. Now at that point, Shari had been missing for 3 days. Hilda wasted no time. She called the deputies immediately after hanging up. So after that chilling phone call, investigators rushed over to the phone company to trace where it came from. It turns out it was placed from a payphone outside a little spot called Taylor's Grocery, and it was just 12 miles from the Smith's house. But when they asked around, nobody remembered seeing anyone near the phone booth. No witnesses, no leads. Since the caller had mentioned that Shari's family would be getting a letter soon, investigators headed straight to the post office. They asked staff to open up early so they could dig through the incoming mail, hoping to intercept whatever it was that was coming. After sifting through piles of envelopes, they finally found it. But the contents weren't what anyone was prepared for. Inside were 2 sheets of legal paper, handwritten by Shari herself. No ransom demands, no instructions, just heartbreak. At the top, she had written last will and testament. In it, she told her family how much she loved them, her parents, her boyfriend, and said she knew she was going to heaven. She told them not to worry about her. Reading that letter, it was devastating. It wasn't just a note. It was a goodbye. And if you hear squawking in the background, it's my daughter's green sheet conure, Freddie. He's given us his 2 cents on this whole thing. But hopefully I can get most of that edited out. If not, everybody, this is Freddie. He made me lose my place. But anyway, reading that letter, it was devastating. It wasn't just a note. It was a goodbye. Once investigators realized that Shari's letter was more of a goodbye than anything else, they kicked things into high gear. Time was running out and they knew it. Remember, the caller had promised he'd be in touch again, so this time the sheriff's department wanted to be ready. They worked with the phone company to set up a trace on the Smith's home line. Now, tracing a phone call isn't as simple as just picking up the phone. To get a location, the caller has to stay on the line for at least a minute, and that's tough, especially when you're dealing with someone who knows the game. These kinds of criminals tend to keep it short, say what they need to say, and hang up fast. So the team came up with a plan. Hilda, Shari's mom, would be the one to answer, and sure enough, the phone rang again. Hilda picked up. But just imagine that moment. Knowing your daughter's life might depend on how long you can keep this man talking. 60 seconds doesn't sound all that long. But under that kind of pressure, it's an eternity. Still, Hilda held her ground. She spoke gently, calmly, trying to keep him engaged. Now, I'm not so sure that I could have been so calm about the whole thing, talking to the person who had snatched my child. But I give it to Miss Smith for keeping it together so that, they could possibly get some answers and trace the call. But anyway, they talked about the letter that Shari had written, and Hilda told him she didn't believe her daughter was okay. Not really. She hadn't heard Shari's voice, hadn't spoken to her directly. Words on paper just weren't enough. The caller told her she'd know in 2 or 3 days if Shari was all right. Hilda asked why, and his response, call the search off, and then click. He was gone. Despite everything, the call hadn't lasted long enough to trace. Chances are he'd rehearsed it. He knew exactly what to say, how to say it, and when to hang up. Cold, calculated, and still no closer to finding Shari. The day after Shari disappeared, her family went on the local news pleading with the public for help and praying for her safe return. And I remember watching that broadcast, 13 years old, sitting in my living room and feeling this wave of sadness hit me. You didn't have to be an adult to feel the heartbreak pouring out of them. It was raw and it really stuck with me. Just a few hours after that emotional plea aired, the Smiths got another call, their third call. Hilda picked up again, and this time she tried to reach the man on the other end, not with anger, but with love. And she told him, I'll never be happy again if Shari's not in my life. And I think that was her way of trying to touch something human in him, maybe soften it. He responded by saying that Shari was still alive despite how sad the letter had sounded. Before hanging up, he promised to call back soon with her location, and just like before, he hung up before the call could be traced. But investigators got lucky. They figured out it came from another nearby phone booth. Then came the fourth call, and instead of giving them answers, he gave them more torment. He said they'd have to wait one more day to see her. Hilda begged him not to hurt her daughter, pleaded with him to keep talking. And his reply, we love and miss y'all, good night. And then click, gone again. So the Smiths spent another night in agony, clinging to hope, praying that Shari was still out there, still alive, and that tomorrow might finally be the day that Shari would come home. By this point, it had been nearly a week since Shari vanished. A week of not knowing if she was okay, a week of hoping, praying, and hanging on to every word from a man who kept calling, promising she'd be returned. But can you imagine the emotional roller coaster, not knowing if he was telling the truth or just lying and toying with him? And as a mom, I can't even begin to wrap my head around the kind of pain her family was living through. Then the next morning at 11:54, the phone rang again. Hilda answered. This time the caller gave her directions, actual directions, to where they could find Shari. He told her to take Highway 378 West, get off at the Prosperity exit, drive 1.5 miles, turn right at the Moose Lodge sign, then take a left after 1/4 mile. He said they'd find them in a backyard behind a house. And then, just like every other time, he hung up. Investigators rushed to the spot while Shari's family stayed behind, clinging to hope that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. Sheriff Metz was the first one to arrive, but what he found wasn't a reunion, it was heartbreak. Shari's body was lying face up on the ground, still dressed in the clothes she'd worn the day that she had disappeared. She'd been covered with a sheet of clear plastic. The 17-year-old girl that an entire state had been praying for was gone. Back at the Smith home, her family waited for news. And when the investigators returned, they didn't even have to say a word. The look on their faces said it all. Deep down, maybe the Smiths had feared this outcome all along, but hearing it out loud, that's a pain nobody should ever have to feel. While the family tried to process the unimaginable, investigators searched the scene for anything. any clue, any trace of the man who had done this. But there was nothing. No fingerprints, no fibers, no evidence. Just Shari's body and the grim realization that she had likely been there for days. And then came the cruelest truth of all. Shari had been killed the very day she was taken. Every phone call after that, every promise, every breadcrumb of hope, it was all a game. The killer had been manipulating her family, dragging them through emotional hell long after Shari was already gone. And even with her body found, he wasn't finished. Not yet. By this point, Hilda was emotionally drained. She couldn't bear to pick up the phone again. Not to hear that voice, not to face whatever new torment she had planned. So investigators turned to Shari's older sister, Dawn. She'd come home from college the moment Shari had went missing, and now, at just 21 years old, she was asked to do the unthinkable. Talk to the man that had murdered her sister. And she did. During that call, the killer told Dawn he'd given Shari a choice, being shot, overdosed, or suffocated. He said she died by suffocation. Dawn, trying to make sense of it all, asked him why. And his answer, it got out of hand. I got scared because only God knows, Dawn. I don't know why. God forgive me for this, but I'm not going to be in prison. And that was his excuse, his justification. I remember watching Dawn talk about this on an episode of an ID show, and I just sat there thinking how incredibly brave she was. She wasn't much older than Shari, just a young woman, face to face with pure evil over the phone, and somehow she kept her composure. Again, I don't think that I could have. There's just no way. But I give it to the Smiths, because they really, under all this pressure and grief and sadness, they kept it together trying to solve this case for their daughter. Sheriff Metz couldn't hold back, though. He grabbed the phone from Dawn and told the caller straight up, "We're going to get you." And honestly, who could blame him? He'd been chasing this case from the moment Shari disappeared. He had kids of his own. This wasn't just a case, it was personal. And that for every parent watching, it felt personal too. It could have been any of our children. This time they got a break. The call was traced to a truck stop about 60 miles away. But when investigators got there, the phone booth was empty. No sign of the killer. And that's when the FBI stepped in. They built a profile. The suspect was likely in his late 20s to early 30s, probably lived alone or with his parents, and was someone people wouldn't suspect, someone who seemed harmless. The profiler also believed the killer would keep calling and that Dawn was the key. She had a way of keeping him talking, and that might be the best shot at catching him. But imagine that weight. At 21, carrying the responsibility of luring your sister's killer into a trap. Every call must have chipped away at her. And then silence. There's no silence from Freddie, and y'all, I do apologize if you hear him in the background. Weeks passed, no calls, no updates, just a haunting quiet. What did it mean? Had he vanished? Was he done? Or was he out there, already planning his next victim? That silence was its own kind of horror. 2 weeks after Shari was taken, another nightmare unfolded, this time in Columbia, South Carolina. A frantic 911 call came in. A 9-year-old girl named Debra May Helmick had just been kidnapped in broad daylight. She and her little brother were playing in their front yard when a man walked right up to them. A neighbor happened to be watching from his window. At first, he thought maybe the guy knew the kids, but then he saw Deborah kicking and struggling as the man grabbed her and sped off in his car. That neighbor ran straight to the Helmick's house, told Deborah's dad what he'd seen, and gave a description of the vehicle. And that's when the call to 911 was made. Police got a composite sketch from the neighbor's description, but it didn't lead anywhere. At first, investigators didn't think Deborah's case was connected to Shari's. The girls were different ages, and the kidnappings happened in different towns. But once both sheriff's departments sat down and compared notes, the pieces started to line up. That realization was gut-wrenching for the Helmick family. They knew how Shari's case had ended, but they still held out hope that Debra's story would be different. 8 days after Debra was taken, another phone call came in, but not to the Helmicks. It went to Dawn Smith. The caller asked if she'd heard about Debra May Helmick, then gave her detailed directions to where police could find the little girl. Sheriff Metz followed those directions, and just like before, he found Debra's body, and she'd been there for days. At that point, investigators knew they were racing against time. If they didn't catch this man soon, there would be another victim. And then finally, there was a break. Remember Shari's handwritten last will and testament? Investigators ran those pages through specialized equipment that can detect these hidden impressions in the paper, things you can't see with the naked eye. What they found was a partial name and part of a phone number. That led them to a couple named Ellis and Sharon Shepard, who lived just a few miles from the Smiths. When questioned, the Shepards explained they'd been out of town for over a month, right during the time both girls were taken. Their alibi checked out, and they were cleared. But before they left the sheriff's office, investigators asked them to listen to a recording of one of the phone calls. Mr. Shepard, he didn't hesitate. He recognized the voice immediately. It was Larry Gene Bell. And when they showed him the composite sketch, he confirmed it. It was Bell. Turns out, while the Shepards were away, Bell had been house-sitting for them. And when they got back, they noticed something strange. He was obsessed with the case. He wouldn't stop talking about it, and he even collected newspaper clippings. Once investigators pulled his criminal record, everything clicked. They knew they had their guy. Turns out, Larry Gene Bell had a history. Convictions for stalking women and making obscene phone calls. One of those arrests even landed him in front of a psychiatrist for counseling. So yeah, when investigators started piecing things together, Bell fit the profile a little too well. He quickly became suspect number one. Then came the manhunt. They didn't waste time. With an arrest warrant in hand, law enforcement swarmed his house, and before long, Bell was in cuffs and headed to the sheriff's office. Once inside the interrogation room, investigators had placed photos of Shari Smith and Debra May Helmick around the room, hoping it might shake something loose. Bell definitely reacted, but he still denied everything. Claimed he didn't know anything about the girls beyond what he'd seen on the news. He'd been in custody for nearly 12 hours when he made a request that stunned everyone. He wanted to meet with Hilda and Dawn Smith. Nobody saw that coming. Investigators weren't even sure the Smiths would agree to it, but they did, hoping it might lead to a confession. During that meeting, Hilda looked Bell in the eye and told him she knew he'd killed her daughter. And then she said something that still sticks with me. She told him that she didn't hate him. I don't know if I could have shown that kind of grace. But even in that moment, Bell refused to admit to anything. But it turns out they didn't need his confession. The search warrants turned up hard evidence. Shari's blood and hair were found on Bell's shoes. And remember that last will and testament she wrote? Investigators had found those indentions on the paper, left behind from a name and partial phone number. And that trail led straight to Bell. At that point, they had enough to formally charge him with Shari's kidnapping and murder. When the case came to trial, Bell tried to play the insanity card. He said bizarre things in court and even took the stand himself, which, as I've mentioned before in other episodes, it's very rare that the accused takes the stand. And get this, while he was on the stand, he asked Dawn Smith to marry him. I mean, what kind of twisted mind does this person have? But the jury didn't buy any of it. It took them just an hour to find him guilty of Shari's kidnapping and murder. After that, Bell was tried for Debra May Helmick's case too. Same outcome, guilty. He was sentenced to death for both murders and was executed on October 4th, 1996. And here's the thing. I've said it before and I'll keep saying it. We like to think we're safe in our quiet little southern towns. But cases like this, they remind us that evil doesn't care about zip codes. Safety isn't guaranteed. Not anywhere. Well, y'all, that's all I have for tonight. Have a great rest of your week. And be sure to come back next week for another all-new episode of Bloodshed and Breadcrumbs. Have a good one.